Welcome everyone, today we have our weekly update on what's been going on in the raid. We are now roughly 4 resets away from the release of Season 2, we are now 5 resets away from the release of the next raid. So it's time to start thinking about what's been going on in this tier in relation to the next season. Who is going to be good? Should I reroll? Should I play the current spec I have been playing? Am I going to be benched, for example? These are things we might start thinking about as we check how the situation has been going in the raid so far. So obviously we come right out of the balance tuning of patch 10.0.7, which has changed quite a few things in the raid. So as we get into it, this time we start upside down. We start with the DPS first. Let's just look at how the situation has been going in the raid when it comes to the damage so far. So we have some familiar, at this point, we have some familiar faces at the top of the performance when it comes to DPS. Once again, we have Retribution Paladin. Yes, we have received a hotfix which has slightly nerfed Retribution Paladin. Most of the nerfs to Ret were to the survivability of Ret Paladin, not nearly as much of a nerf to the damage of Ret Paladin. So this should not really change the position of Ret Paladin in the current raid meta so far. So that is one thing. We also have other presences at the top of the performance in the raid, like for example Subtlety Rogue and Outlaw Rogue, which have been there for quite a while. We also have gotten the growth, the sudden growth still there of all 3 of the Warlock specs which were buffed in 10.0.7. Initially, Affliction was much higher up because of a bug fix, giving them 5% more damage and 5% haste. That has since been changed, and now Affliction is not nearly as powerful as it was before, but definitely better than its pre 10.0.7 version. What continues to be perhaps a little bit worrying, especially given that they are not planned to receive, at the very least for now, they are not planned to receive changes in patch 10.1 in the next season, and their tier sets do not look very impressive. We are talking about mages. Arcane, Fire and Frost Mage are all towards the bottom of raid performance. Their tier sets look mediocre at best in the next season. There are no, at the moment, balance tuning notes, buffs for the mages next season. So they are perhaps the least impressive, the least exciting specs for the next season, the next raid. That is quite weird to see, because mages usually, at least one of the 3 mage specs, ends up being quite powerful. This has not been the case so far in this expansion. We also have, surprisingly, since it started quite well and the stocks of this spec were reasonably high in the raid, Enhancement Shaman. Enhancement Shaman is at the moment the 2nd worst performing spec in the raid. They do have a better, definitely better than mages, they have a better tier set compared to the mage specs. They seem to be planned to be doing better because of that in the next season, but perhaps just that won't be enough to change their current situation in the raid. What is also a significant difference is the gap between Unholy and Frost DK. Both of these specs were buffed in 10.0.7, but the buff to Frost Death Knight, the runic power cost increase of Breath of Sindragosa in exchange for 25% more damage, has skyrocketed their performance compared to before, while the buffs to Unholy were not nearly as impressive compared to their brother spec. So that's one of the main differences so far in the performance of the DPS specs in the raid. The last one worth mentioning, of course, is the other class, which was buffed in its entirety after the buffs to the Warlock specs in their entirety. 10.0.7 also buffed Hunters. So we do have a better performance of, in particular, of Marksmanship Hunter, which is doing significantly better than before. So this is the situation at the moment when it comes to the raid. It looks like overall Ret Paladin is just the best performer in general. Even if you look at the most important of all the fights, which is Raszageth, you see that Ret Paladin is still dominating at the top. Some might even say, well, Razaget has a bunch of ads, you know, Red Paladin might be padding with a bunch of AoE during Razaget. Well, no, this is the damage to just Razaget, to just the boss of Razaget fight, and still Red Paladin is the number one in terms of damage. So this seems to be the situation right now when it comes to the DPS specs. Just like we did in Mythic Plus, and trying to gauge, trying to think which of the specs might be the more wanted, the more needed in the next season. If we were to do it now for the DPS as well, perhaps the same thing will be done for Red. Perhaps we live in a world where Red Paladin will be a quite wanted DPS specs in the next raid tier. Of course, it's hard to try to say right now, seriously, guys, don't go for Mage. Guys, Mage right now is doing little damage, and then the tier sets are weak, so you should really just not roll, not reroll, not play a Mage for the next season, right? It's always very risky. We know how Blizzard cares very often for mages, so the Giga buff to make them meta out of nowhere might be just behind the corner. So it's always very risky to abandon Mage completely. The more safe pick at the moment, as usual at this point, seems to be Rogue. Rogue seems to have at least one of their specs doing always well in the raid, so that's a decent pick if you're playing melee. If you are too scared, if you don't want to take too much hopium and you don't want to believe in Red Paladin continuing to do well into the next tier, then for melee, Rogue seems to be the safest pick, whereas for the ranged, the safest pick is definitely Warlock. After getting buffed, a couple of their tier sets are also looking quite good, their current situation is good, plus Warlock is always needed in the raid, so it's definitely a safe choice. As we mentioned in the Mythic Plus video as well, Shadow Priest is undergoing a rework for the next season, Balanced Druid is undergoing another rework in the next season, so they are much more risky to be playing, to hope that those reworks are going to be fine and turn out good. So overall, I would say that the safest and the most promising of the ranged spec is currently being basically Warlock in general, as a class for the next raid. Then we have the amazing tale of the healers, because 10.0.7 did something to the healers. It did buff a few of them here and there, Holy Priest, Discipline, Mistweaver, even Resto Shaman by a lot, and in particular though nerfed Preservation Evoker. So last time we saw how Preservation Evoker dropped down to the third to last place in the HPS standings. Now it's been one more week and it's been one more spot lost by Preservation. Now they also are losing out to Holy Paladin. So at the moment, Preservation is setting itself up to be the worst of the healer specs, just above Discipline in the raid. Now, one would ask itself, is it really warranted for being powerful for 2.5 months into the first tier of its existence, of being created by Blizzard, getting immediately gutted, getting immediately kneecapped by Blizzard to going down to being one of the weaker ones? You know, there are specs which remained super powerful or super popular powerhouses in Mythic Plus for years, or in the raid for years, and this happened to Preservation Evoker very, very quickly, basically. You can even see here the representation of the change. This was the situation in the raid right before the release of patch 10.0.7, with Preservation Evoker coasting above everyone else, and the other three specs towards the bottom, Resto Shaman, Discipline, and Holy Paladin. And now, after the changes, we just have a change of color. The one coasting towards the top now is blue, because it's Resto Shaman. And you see that Preservation Evoker now is hanging towards the bottom instead. So this seems to be the main change when it comes to healers. You can even see it pictured in the popularity. Now, Preservation Evoker has, of course, lost out to Restoration Druid, is getting almost past, is getting closer and closer, caught up by Holy Priest. It's likely that Resto Shaman also will continue to grow up, even Holy Paladin is growing as well, so it's bound to lose more and more ranks by the time we get to Season 2. So the question for healers, for what to play as a healer in Season 2, is quite the challenging one. We had the same question in the video for Mythic Plus. This will also be, of course, decided even more crucially by the power of the tier sets. Some of the specs in here have quite the weak tier sets. One of the standout weak tier sets in this clamp, for example, is Holy Priest as well as Holy Paladin. Discipline Priest, for example, now just got a super powerful raid tier set. The Preservation Evoker tier set is quite powerful for the Blossom build in the raid. Restoration Druid also has a giga powerful tier set for the raid in particular as well. So weighting the power of the tier sets as well might shape up the priority, the value of the healers for the next season. Is definitely one of the harder roles to try to guess, to try to properly be correct in which of the healers will end up become the standard pick when it comes to the next season. What this will not be as hard as the healer pick is the tank choice, because in the tank choice, of course, in the raid, it's always been not nearly as important. If you think about it, almost by a pure causality, the top tanks in the raid often end up being the top tanks in Mythic Plus. Incredible, right? It's almost as if the top tanks in Mythic Plus end up being brought in the raid, because in the end, the tank you bring in the raid doesn't really matter. There are a few instances where, of course, having a certain tank is very helpful, like, for example, bringing a Blood Death Knight to Razaget, so you can ignore the wins. You don't have to bother about saving a tank because the Blood Death Knight can just ignore it, for example. That is quite a good one. But in general, if you are the meta spec as a tank in Mythic Plus, you end up being the more popular of the tanks in the raid. And this is likely what is going to happen, and likely what is happening now. What a surprise! Prot Paladin is now the meta tank in Mythic Plus, and now that we look at the popularity of tanks in the raid, look at that. There is a gigantic growth of Prot Paladin in the raid. This week they got to almost pass Prot Warrior, and I'm betting the house that I don't have on this. By next week, Protection Paladin will have passed Protection Warrior and will have gotten closer to Blood Death Knight. So having to try to guess, try to gauge what is going to happen in Season 2 based on what's been going on here. Obviously, the most simple of the options seems to be just go Prot Paladin. The second tank choice, the second option, is likely going to be, just like it is now, a split between Blood DK and Prot Warrior. Blood DK is always useful in the raid. The grips to control the ads, the anti-magic shell to cheese some mechanics, the self-sustain, the self-healing of the Blood DK are usually always very good in the raid. So it looks like it's gonna be a combo of Prot Paladin and Blood DK, or Prot Paladin and Prot Warrior. So also not that much of a hope for Brewmaster Vengeance and Guardian Druid. Neither of them are planned at the moment to be getting buffs in 10.1. There are no PTR planned notes buffing these specs. The tier set bonuses of these three specs are not particularly powerful, so it doesn't look like there isn't any reason as to why we could expect these three bottom tanks to become any more powerful, at the very least for the moment, compared to the top three tanks that we do expect to become the meta choice in Season 2, with Prot Paladin at the forefront of the three, also of being the new meta tank in Mythic Plus. Therefore, by being the meta tank in Mythic Plus, it will be the most played tank, so in the raid it will also be the most played tank. This is how it looks like for now when it comes to the raid choices of tanks. So while it's quite easy to gauge and guess which of the tanks are going to be popular and powerful by Season 2, based on what we are seeing right now in the raid. When it comes to the melee DPS, it might also be somewhat predictable. We have seen rogues doing well consistently. Some of the rogues have quite the powerful tier sets as well. We have seen Red Paladin continuing to grow. It is also possibly predictable when it comes to the range DPS, given how well the Warlock specs are doing right now and how not well the mage specs or something like Balance Druid are doing now. What is a bit riskier when it comes to the range DPS is, as we mentioned, the two reworks that two of their specs are receiving. The mini rework to Balance and the full rework to Shadow. These two seem to be the bigger question marks when it comes to deciding how things are going to shape up for range DPS in Season 2. And then lastly, we have the bigger of the question marks, which is going to be set on healers. Healers have different priorities in who is strong in Mythic Plus, who is strong in the raid. A lot might change based on what they can bring as an extra from their tier sets as well. So we have to wait perhaps a little bit more when it comes to trying to guess and trying to gauge which of the healers is going to end up being more powerful. But at the moment, as we mentioned, with 4 to 5 weeks, 4 to 5 resets left to the release, to the end of Season 1 and then the release of Season 2, we have nothing else to do but wait and see, for example, if Blizzard adds some more tuning to these specs and then some more tuning, for example, to the tier sets for the specs for Season 2. So for now, I'm going to leave you to whatever else you were doing. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the Patreon supporters for the help and the contribution to the growth of this channel. You can, however, still support in completely free ways. You can like and comment down below on this video because this is what YouTube wants, apparently. You can also subscribe to the channel itself. And then more free ways to support would be to follow me over on my Twitter, as well as following me over on my stream on Twitch. So outside of these social unpleasantries, thank you guys for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, it's day 2 of this polar cold coming down my town. Doesn't seem to be stopping. I don't mind it, to be honest. I'm fine with cold.